Edificio.
6:04 p.m., June 24th. In a country celebrating 200 years of independence, the ground suddenly moves. 40 seconds later, it moves again, harder. This wasn't one earthquake, it was two, striking less than a minute apart, hitting the same country on the same night. And as darkness fell over Caracas, no one among the millions standing outside knew one thing for certain: whether the ground beneath them was still safe to return to. June 24th is a special day for Venezuelans. It marks the anniversary of a military victory in 1821, the battle that paved the way for the country's independence from Spain. Schools were closed, offices were closed, millions of families were home, together, with no reason to think this evening would be any different. Caracas, the capital, sits in a narrow valley surrounded by mountains. Much of the housing here and across the country isn't built to withstand much. According to assessments from the U.S. Geological Survey, a large share of Venezuelans live in unreinforced brick homes or mud brick structures, the kind of construction that's especially vulnerable when the ground starts to shake. This city is no stranger to earthquakes. In 1967, a magnitude 6.3 quake killed hundreds of people here. But that memory had faded over nearly 6 decades. No one preparing dinner that evening imagined history was about to repeat itself in a far more devastating way.
Mierda, esa verga.
6:04 p.m. local time, about 160 kilometers west of Caracas, near the coastal town of Morón. The Earth's crust shifted. A magnitude 7.2 earthquake erupted at a depth of 22 kilometers. That's strong enough to flatten an entire neighborhood if it strikes directly above the epicenter. But what caught geologists' attention wasn't just the magnitude, it was the location. Venezuela sits along the boundary between the Caribbean and South American tectonic plates, one of the most active fault zones in the region, yet one far less closely monitored than places like California or Japan. In Caracas, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, people still felt the shaking clearly. One office worker recalled picking up her phone just as the ground began to tremble. Within seconds, everything around her was moving violently. The lights went out, windows cracked, and in that instant, millions of people had the same single thought: get outside. But they wouldn't have long to catch their breath. Seconds. That's how much time passed between the first earthquake and the second, the one that would deliver the real blow. This time, the epicenter sat just a few kilometers from the first, near the town of Yumari in Yaracuy State, at a shallower depth, around 10 kilometers. Magnitude 7.5. Shallow earthquakes tend to be more destructive than deep ones because the energy has less distance to dissipate before reaching the surface. And this time, that energy slammed into an area that had just been weakened by the first shock. Seismologists call this a doublet earthquake. Two major quakes striking in extremely close succession, each strong enough to be a disaster on its own. This pair is now recorded as the strongest to hit Venezuela in over a century. In Caracas, people who had barely caught their breath after the first tremor now faced a second one, stronger, and this time with almost nothing left standing firm.
Yo sí sentía que se movía mi silla y el cable del celular.
¡Jesús! ¡Dios mío! ¡Jesús! ¿Qué es eso?
Nah, huevón, locura, marico.
Frente a la entrada de Santa Sofía.
The staircase collapsed. The walls cracked everywhere. Things fell from the ceiling. It was terrifying. That's how a 54-year-old bank employee in Caracas described the moment. She was just one of millions who watched her city change in a matter of seconds. Another resident remembered the building swaying violently from side to side, as if the entire structure were struggling to stay upright on a ship caught in a storm. The Altamira and Chacaco districts in eastern Caracas became flashpoints of the disaster. At least 2 buildings collapsed completely, and many others suffered severe structural damage. Dust clouds rose from neighborhoods once filled with busy restaurants and shops. The biggest problem was timing. The earthquake struck in the evening after daylight had already faded, making search and rescue work far harder. Rescue teams had to dig through the rubble in near darkness, all while aftershocks could strike at any moment. Venezuela's interior minister confirmed on state television that several buildings in Caracas had collapsed and urged residents to stay outdoors, warning that aftershocks could cause further damage to already weakened structures. Came. More than 500 emergency responders were deployed to the Chacao district alone. They managed to pull at least 18 people alive from the rubble, but no one knew how many others were still trapped beneath it.
mira, Caribe, weón. Macuto, La Guaira.
Faced with the scale of the disaster, Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, declared a nationwide state of emergency. A high-level task force was formed to direct search and rescue operations. The country's entire public and private healthcare network was mobilized to treat the rising number of injured. The damage wasn't limited to collapsed buildings. Maiquetía International Airport, Venezuela's largest, serving Caracas directly, had to shut down completely while officials assessed damage to its infrastructure. The subway system and several rail lines were suspended. Many areas in and around Caracas lost power, water, and telecommunications, all of which made rescue efforts even harder. The government canceled school nationwide for the rest of the week. Activities deemed non-essential were temporarily suspended. The disaster's reach extended well beyond Caracas. The states of Miranda, La Guaira, Aragua, Carabobo, and Falcón all reported damage. In Falcón state alone, at least 32 people were hospitalized, and officials estimated dozens more were still trapped in collapsed areas. Even Bogotá, the capital of neighboring Colombia, far from the epicenter, felt tremors strong enough to set off alarms and prompt some residents to evacuate buildings as a precaution.
Vamos a ver el Vamos a ver el parque náutico. Deben haber gente ahí.
Claro que hay gente.
This is the part that made anyone following this disaster pause. The U.S. Geological Survey uses a system called PAGER, Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response, to generate rapid estimates of human impact based on shaking intensity, population density, and how vulnerable local buildings are. For this doublet earthquake, the system issued a red alert, its highest warning level. Based on the model, the number of people killed or affected was estimated to range anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000, with a meaningful probability of landing at the higher end of that range. It's important to be clear about what this means. This is not a confirmed casualty count. It's an automated risk model designed to give emergency responders a fast sense of a disaster's potential scale before there's enough on-the-ground information to know for sure. But even as a forecast, the sheer range of that number says something unsettling on its own. When an earthquake strikes a country with vulnerable infrastructure, at the exact moment millions of people are home for a holiday, the damage stops being measured in small numbers. In the Chacao district, the local mayor confirmed there had been deaths, though no specific figure had been released. Acting President Rodriguez also confirmed fatalities and offered condolences to grieving families. But a full nationwide count still hadn't been released as the first hours of the disaster unfolded.
Ahorita, en los palos grandes, voy a la misa y el semáforo se pone en verde y la gente parada y yo toco corneta y pasan. Y cuando paso, aquí estoy a 20 metros del edificio, empieza a temblar y paro el carro y se cayó el edificio donde estaba el semáforo. Yo estaba parado ahí.
In the hours immediately after the disaster, speed was the only priority. Venezuela's rescue teams, alongside police, the military, and firefighters, raced against the clock to find anyone still trapped under the rubble. Every hour that passed in darkness meant fewer chances for survivors buried beneath the debris. The government authorized cutting gas supplies to several damaged buildings to prevent fires, a quieter but no less dangerous threat that often follows major earthquakes. Acting President Rodriguez also appealed to international financial institutions for support in the recovery effort, a sign that the scale of the damage had outpaced what any single country could handle on its own. And amid all the numbers, the warnings, the epicenter maps, the simplest image remained the most powerful. Neighbors standing together on dark streets, unsure if their homes were still standing, just holding on to the person beside them and waiting.
Marico, miren esto, weón.
Edificio Rita de San Bernardino, aproximadamente 7 pisos y unos 20 apartamentos. Todos al suelo. Están pidiendo silencio para ver si encuentran gente con vida. Esto es Municipio Libertador, Caracas, capital de Venezuela. Lo que vemos aquí en la pantalla del celular es la azotea del edificio. Muchas personas.
Venezuela suffered a devastating earthquake back in 1967. Nearly 6 decades later, the earth beneath this country reminded humanity of a truth we tend to forget. The ground we build our entire lives on, our roads, our homes, our cities, is just a thin layer resting on something that never truly stands still. 40 seconds between 2 earthquakes is shorter than a song, but it was enough to turn an independence celebration into a night an entire nation will never forget. Perhaps the only thing humanity can do in the face of forces this far beyond our control isn't to stop them, it's to build sturdier, prepare smarter, so that the next time the ground speaks again, we won't have to pay the price in numbers no one wants to read twice.
No sé si hay alguien ahí porque estábamos full. Las muchachas salieron, pero no sé si hay alguien. No sé si hay alguien. Salió todo esto. Hay alguien. Salga todo, Guadalupe, vente.
No hay nadie.
¿Será que ellos estaban en el club, José?
La carretera, la redoma de Morón.
Terremoto en La Guaira.
Terremoto en La Guaira.
Mina, La Palmató. Farmacias destruidas.
Destruyó todo. Destruyó todo, Arima Margaret. Destruido.
Terremoto que colapsó, papá. Destruido la agencia. Pobre la gente que estaba allá adentro. La gente que no entra en estas cosas. La gente menos mal no, porque esto era privado. Vamos.
La locura, señores, la locura, la locura.
Los chinos, la locura, viejo, mira. La locura, moto, gente allá adentro. La locura, señores.